What's up, everybody? This is Alex with WMD back at you again. And this time we're going to be talking about switches. In particular, we're going to be talking about the new WMD SL3KT, also known as Select. So this is our tiny little 4 HP module, and it has 3 channels of switches that are bidirectional, meaning you can either take 2 different sources and then 1 output and switch between them, or you can take 1 source into this input here, and then you can switch between, you can send that to 2 different destinations. So why would you want something like this? There's a ton of reasons. The very first thing, and actually the reason why we created this to begin with, was just to be able to switch between 2 sequencers. So one of my things that I do is I have a bass voice that I love. It's just kind of a Moog style 2 oscillator, 1 filter, subtractive voice. And then I have 2 sequencers. So I have the Metron and Volterra combo, and then I have an Expert Sleepers ES8 module that I use with my computer. And so I use the Select, running gate and CV into it, to select between which sequencer I'm using for said bass voice. So that is one cool use case for it. Another thing you can do is you can do this really cool waveform mixing kind of thing where you take 2 different waveforms and then you switch between them at audio rate, and that'll give you some cool complex waveforms. You can also do some logic stuff and some preset kind of things to route different modulation sources to your voice. So we're going to cover all of that, and we're just going to dive right into it. So let's do it. So as you can see here, I've got some drums set up. I've got a sequencer going, and then my Select right here is completely blank. So if we just listen to what I've got so far, I've just got a cool little beat, right? And I'm just going to switch that over to more of a 4 on the floor kind of thing, just for simplicity's sake. But that's where we're starting off. And what we're going to do first is we're going to use the Select to switch between 2 different sequencer sources. So I have the Architect here, and then I have Metron and Volterra together as a gate and CV sequencer. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to make a voice. So I'm just going to go out of the triple bipolar VCA here, and I'm going to run that into our channel 4. And then I'm going to use the multi-mode envelope here to modulate some TB-VCA modulation to create some harmonics. If you want more examples on the TB or the TB-VCA with the PDO voice, we have another video, so I'll put a link to that in the video. So now what we're going to do is let's just set up a simple Architect voice sequence so we can just kind of hear what's going on. So I'm going to take the gate out of the Architect, run it into the multi-mode envelope, volt per octave into the PDO, and then I'm just going to take output 9 here. I'm going to run that into the step input on Architect. I'll take output 10 and I'll run that into the reset. Let's go look at these gates real quick. Clean up this a little bit. We'll go to gate. You can see here's my step lane, and then here's my reset lane. So when I bring up the sequence, this is the kind of sound we're making. I'm going to tune that down. There we go. That's a cool sound. And so there's my Architect, right? I can change between different gate patterns and things like that, put my resets in different places. I can put some slides in here, and I can change up the notes that it's playing. All right, so there we go. Let's shorten up the envelope a little bit. And then let's just hear it with some drums. All right, so that's pretty cool, right? So this is one way to sequence, but as you can tell in this, I don't have very many voice options, but I can use the Volterra as a sequencer as well. So in order to do that, I would need to just switch my gate and CV sources, right? So I'm going to go volt per octave out of the Volterra, And then we'll just say gate come out of channel 13 here. And then we'll run some gates. And then we'll just move some CV around here. And let's change up my quantization here so I can get some different notes. So there's my sequence coming out of Volterra. Let's listen to that with the drums. So yeah, we've got two cool sequences just from these two different sources, right? So right now, if I want to just switch over to the Architect, I have to actually physically move the patch and take my gate out of Architect instead of out of Metron and Volterra. So with Select, we can use this switch to switch between the two different sources. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take the gate out. We're going to go out of channel 1 here. We're going to go volt per octave out of channel 2. And then we're going to use our gate input or our gate output. We're going to run that into the A side of the sequencer from Architect. And then we're going to take the volt per octave and run that, or sorry, out of the switch. You know what I mean. We're going to go volt per octave into the A side of the switch there. And now when I put the switch on this side, we can hear that sequence, right? The cool thing about Select is that the switches are actually normal to each other. So this switch will affect this one, which will affect this one. So it'll just kind of be the opposite of what it is. It'll toggle the switch. So what's cool about that is we can just use this one switch here to move between this sequencer and this sequencer, which we have nothing going into right now. So now we'll take our volt per octave out of Volterra. We'll run it into channel B, or side B of Select. And then we'll take that gate number 13, we'll run that into gate B on channel 1 here. And now just with a flip of a switch, we can switch between what sequencer we're listening to. So let's listen to the drums again. So we can do that manually. That's a really fun way to just kind of get some variation as far as a performance is concerned, right? So you're playing, and we can say, all right, this is kind of like song 1, right? Using the Volterra. And I'm gonna put in some different notes here. There we go, so that's our sequence. And now let's say I want to go into a different sound, so or a different song, right? So I can just kind of take out the kick drum here. Maybe I'll change up my chimera pattern. And then I'll say at the same time when I bring it back the kick drum, we're just going to switch. So that's a cool way to just kind of switch between two different patterns, right? So doing that manually is just a nice way, like say you have a sequencer that's more like the computer, right? So you write some songs on there, and then I use the Metron and Volterra for more of a improvisational kind of thing. So it's nice for me to be able to switch between my two sequencer sources just by hand here. So we also have CV inputs for each switch. So if you plug into a CV that's below, that's on channel either 2 or 3, you're going to break that normal. So now the switch on the top won't affect the switches below it. So if you do want to have independent switches and not have any one affect the next one, you can just plug a dummy cable in there. If you have a broken cable, just cut the end off, put it in there, and that's a cool way to just kind of to make them more independent. But again, with this normaling, it's really convenient just to switch with one switch to get all the sources to move. All right, so going along with that CV input, there's a couple other things we can do. So I'm going to bring our drums back in. and we're listening to the left side of the select. So right now we're listening to the architect, right? And I'm going to go through here and change up the architect's pattern here. All right, so I like that. That's pretty cool. So I'm going to say let's associate this side of the switch with pattern A. We're going to copy A over to B. And with Metron, we are now listening to pattern A, but we're editing pattern B. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to change up the Chimera pattern. And then I'll change up a couple more things with the clap. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to say on pattern B, I'm going to take this Volterra output number 2, and I'm going to run that into CV input 1 on the select here. And then I'm going to create an offset of 5 volts on step 1 of pattern B, and do an offset of 0 volts on the first on pattern A. So now when we switch between the two, we can go to pattern B here. We're going to switch the pattern. So we're actually switching between 2 different sequencers just with these 2 different patterns here. So then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this over to C. And let's go over and listen to C. And I'm going to make C longer. I'm going to make it a 4-bar pattern. And now I'm just going to record this knob movement. And we're actually going to switch within the pattern between the 2 sequencers, creating a new cool sequence. So now we can listen to that. So now C is a 4-bar pattern, and it's switching between the 2 sequencers to get more of kind of a random thing, but it still sounds really nice because they're in the same key. The sequences are in the same key. So we'll go over to A. It's just the architect. Go to B. Just Metron and Volterra. We'll go to C. Now we're switching between the 2. So this can be really useful if you're using sequencers that don't save, right? So let's say, if you have a sequencer that saves, you can make a sequence, you can alter it, you can save the 2, you can go in between the 2 and things like that. But if you're using more of an analog style sequencer or something older that doesn't save, you can actually use a switch to say, I'm going to use this pattern and then this pattern. And then you can kind of have an A section and a B section just by using 2 sequencers with the same voice. Again, mixing those 2 together in between in the pattern is just another way to get some cool variation and just get a little bit of both sequencers in the same pattern. All right, so what else can we do with the switch? Next, what we're going to do is we're going to make a little preset, and we're going to be able to switch between 2 different sounds on the same voice. So I'm going to pull all these out real quick. And we'll just start from scratch. I'm going to leave the drums in, because you know me, I just love to jam, right? All right, so we've got, and I'm going to leave the architect plugged in because that's what we're going to use for the sequence itself. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a quick little subtractive voice with spectrum. So I'm going to run the spectrum into the aperture. We'll go out of the aperture into the ADSR VCA. Out of the ADSR VCA into the mixer. And we will take the volt per octave of architect, we'll run that into the spectrum, volt per octave input, and we'll take the gate out and run it into the gate input of ADSR VCA. And now we'll hear a little bit of something. We're going to take the envelope output of ADSR VCA, we're going to run that into the low pass CV on aperture. And we're going to get a pretty traditional sounding voice here. So this is your standard kind of low pass filter. Low pass filter subtractive voice. So I'm going to just tune this guy down a little bit, just to get a little bit different of a sound here. Let's listen to that with the drums. Turn it up a little bit maybe. All right, cool. So that's a pretty dope sound we've got going on. And this is just a very standard voice, right? So what if we want to mix it up mid-set? Like we want to do it in the middle of our performance. We want to go from this real standard subtractive voice into something like a crazy FM kind of experimental patch. Well, what I like to do is use select to switch between, we're going to select between two different waveforms. We're also going to route some modulation through it. And then with the flip of the top switch, we'll be able to enable that experimental voice or go back to this subtractive one. So first things first, let's make that voice, right? So instead of going from saw wave directly into aperture, I'm going to run that into the A side of select. Then I'm going to take the sine wave out because I really like to use sine waves with frequency modulation voices. I'm going to run that into side B. And then we'll take the output of that and we'll run it into the aperture here. So right now we're hearing the same voice we were hearing, and then when I switch to the right, it's just a sine wave going through the filter. So I can turn the dry wet mix down so we're just going to hear the difference, right? So we've got saw wave here, sine wave here. All right. So now we need to route some modulation, right? So I'm going to take the output of the PDO and I'm going to run that into the FM input on Spectrum. We'll turn that up a little bit. And then we should probably have that be following the same volt per octave, right? So I'm going to take the volt per octave of Architect and I'm going to run this Y cable into the volt per octave on PDO as well as on the Spectrum. And now here's that kind of experimental voice. And why don't we, just to take it one further, let's use this same envelope that we're using for the filter to modulate some stuff. Let's just do frequency modulation of the PDO. It's kind of crazy. That might need to be attenuated before we do that. So let's see if we can get that going on here. So I'm going to go out of the envelope here and I'm going to gotta get a stackable cable here. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the envelope out here and we're just gonna run one side back into the low pass CV. And then we're gonna go through an attenuator with the other one before we go into the FM of PDO. So that gives us more of this kind of crazy laser sound, right? All right, so now if we switch between the two voices, we're still getting that same sound, but we're just using a saw wave instead of a sine wave, right? So what we need to do is we need to run this modulation, instead of going directly into the Spectrum, we're going to run it into the B side of select. This means that then we're going to take the output here, we're going to run that into the FM. This means when we're on the A side, we're still listening to that square wave coming through and it's not affected. It's just going through here and then that's going into out of the select into the aperture and we're getting that normal voice. And by normal, I just mean subtractive, nice little voice. But now we can just, with a flip of a switch over to this more experimental sound. And let's say that on this side, we want the filter to be more open, right? So right here on the subtractive side, we like this sound, but when we go over to this side, we just want more width out of the filter. So I'm going to use the same technique. I'm going to go out of the last channel here. Oops, I just kicked my power supply and unplugged it on accident. All right, so let's just start up some drums and let's just make a new sequence here. We'll go back into this guy. All right, so not too much different. So we've got our sound here. And where were we? What were we going to do? We were just going to open up the aperture. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to take another cable, and we've got that plugged in to the width here. And so on this switch, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run an offset from Volterra into side B, and I'm going to turn that offset all the way up. And let's make sure that that's a 0 to 5 volt quantization, and we'll turn that up to 5 volts. So now the width CV will go all the way up when we're allowing that signal to go through. And on this side, it's going to go back down to a smaller width. So there we go. There's our sound. We've got the more traditional kind of subtractive voice here. And then we can just say, I'm just going to make a different sequence here. And then we're just going to go here, flip the switch. Maybe make it a little bit more percussive here. And switch back. So again, let's do that with some CV. I'm just going to take the Volterra output number 1, and I'm going to run that into the CV input on select here, and I'm going to record some CV. Woohoo! Turn up the FM a little bit on the spectrum. All right, that's some pretty hyphy stuff right there. All right. That's enough of that. That's just too much fun. So yeah, we can use, we can use it to select between modulation sources. So, and actually, we're listening to 2 different waveforms. So on the left side, again, we've got the saw wave, and then on the right side, we've got modulation going through, and then we've also got, we're now listening to the sine wave. So we're just getting a whole different sound, and we can switch that just with the switch on the top or with CV, so that's super useful. Okay, so next we are going to do some cool waveform mixing. So this is going to be taking 2 simple waveforms and mixing them together to kind of get more of an experimental sound. So first things first, I'm just going to pull our patch, again, everything except for the drums.
Because we be jamming. So let's pull all this stuff out.
And what we're going to use for this one is we're going to use the PDO, and we're just going to run output 1 into one side of the switch. So let me grab a cable that'll reach here. So output 1 is going to go into A. We're going to take output 2. We're going to run that into B. And now we're just going to take the output of that channel and we're going to run it directly into the mixer here. So now we'll listen, and you can see that we've got a sine wave going on here. So I'm just going to adjust my oscilloscope here to try and make it a little bit more steady here. All right, so you can see we've got our sine wave here, and now output 2. We can switch the waveform on output 2. Let's get more of this like wave folded sine. All right, cool. So now we can switch between those 2. We can say we've got a sine wave here. We've got this more harmonic rich sine wave or waveform there. And now we're just going to take output 3. We're going to take the same output. And we're going to say I want this one to be a square wave. And we're going to run this into the CV input of select. And now you can see that we've kind of got this halfway mix here. So if we use a saw wave instead of a square wave, we get a little bit different of a shape here. But now you can see on the oscilloscope that we have a mix between that sine wave and the other waveform, the kind of wave folded sine. What's cool about PDO is I can move the phases around for each of the waveforms here, and we can create these different complex wave shapes. So there's some modules out there that do this, but this is kind of a fun way to just kind of get these cool different waveforms. So now what we can do is we can modulate that phase with something like Modbox, this LFO here. So I'm just going to do the phase of output 1 here. Now we've kind of got this cool waveform mixed sound here. Why don't we modulate the phase of output number 3 as well? This is the output. We're going to do this on a different phase of the Modbox. We're going to go 240 out, run that into CV4, and then turn that output up. This is the phase of the, oh, we're going to go into 3, my bad. This is the phase of the waveform that's actually changing the switch. So we're going to get this kind of really dynamic kind of sound here. So we're modulating the phase of output number 2 as well as output number 3. So this is just a cool thing to just kind of get some different waveforms out of some simple ones. So let's hear what it sounds like when we just go between 2 sine waves. So now you can see on our oscilloscope we've got these 2 sine waves kind of mixing together. I'm going to take the phase modulation out here so we can really see what's going on the oscilloscope here. Let's move some phase around. Again, this kind of wave folded thing. Here we go. So now let's, instead of using the saw wave to modulate, we're going to use a square wave again. That's pretty cool. So you can use, what's nice about using the PDO for this technique is that all of these oscillators are perfectly in tune. What's it do if you have 2 oscillators that are not necessarily in tune? Well, let's find out. So I'm going to take the CV out of the select for now. We'll listen to the triangle wave on the spectrum. So we've got the sine wave on the left side, on the A side, and we've got the triangle wave from the spectrum on the right side. I'm going to try and get it in tune with each other. That's pretty close. So now we're just going to take that output of number 3 again of the PDO. We're going to run that into the CV here. And now you can see that because they're not perfectly in tune, we're kind of having one take over the other. And that's that beating that we're seeing, is them not being perfectly in tune. So I can really fine tune the spectrum and try and get them more in tune with each other. There we've got a pretty cool waveform there. But I can also take it out, back out of tune, and we've got this kind of modulation sound happening. So this is a fun thing to experiment with for creating complex wave shapes, and then you can run those through a filter and use those as your basic waveform before for a subtractive synth patch or something like that. So that's a fun way to use a switch as well. All right, so as you could tell, it's a new day. Same video, got some new clothes on, but we're going to be doing a new patch, so it's kind of fitting, right? So what we're going to do now is logic functions. There are plenty of logic modules out there. Metron can do some logic stuff with the assignable inputs, and there's lots of ways to achieve this, but if you have a switch and a voltage offset, you can get the same thing without needing a dedicated module. So that's kind of cool. So what is logic? Logic is basically a way of processing gate signals. So a gate signal is just a signal that's high and just rides until it's low, right? So it's a good thing to use to control envelopes and drums and things like that. I'm going to use it for drums. Obviously, trigger signals are a little bit better for drum signals, but in order for you to be able to just hear what's going on and just see it immediately, I think using a drum is the easiest way to decipher that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do an invert patch. An invert patch basically is what it sounds like. If the gate is high, we're not going to get a gate output. If the gate is low, we're going to get a gate output. So how are we going to do this? Let's just plug in our crucible real quick and just make a pattern. So we're going to go into 9. We're just going to make a pattern here, and then I'll turn it up on the mixer. Whoops, wrong channel. And there we go. And so like I said, for using the switch, you want to use gate signals. We don't just want to use triggers, we want to use gate signals. So I'm going to use 100% gates here. And instead of running straight into Crucible, we're going to take that and we're going to put it in the CV input of the select. So now you can see that it's switching between the two sides just every time it gets a gate. So now what we're going to do is we're going to run a 5-volt offset. So I'm just going to take Volterra. You can see that on step 1 I've programmed in 5 volts here. And so it's just going to keep running there. And I'm going to plug that into side A. And now we're going to take that output and we're going to run it into the Crucible again. So now you can see that we're getting gates when we're not right after each one of our gate signals. So once the gate signal goes low, that's when we're hearing that signal go, or the cymbal go off. So now if I play the drums, you can hear that that's a pattern. That's the inverted pattern. If we want to hear the regular pattern, all we have to do is just flip the switch. And now we have the normal pattern. So I'm going to put in a couple more triggers here. And I got to make those gates. Right, there we go. Now when I flip to the other side of the switch, we're going to hear it change. So that's cool for creating fills or anything that you just want to create a little bit of variation. It's a really fast way just to change something up on the fly. All right, so next we're going to do AND. AND is a function where you need 2 gates or you need 2 voltage signals, and both sides need to be high in order for you to get a gate signal out. So if one's high and the other one's not, you're not going to get a gate signal out. If both are high, you will. All right, so now let's set that up. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to do 2 gate signals out. So we're going to take number 10 and we're going to run that into side B, and then we're going to take number 9 and we're just going to run that into the CV still. So that's just going into the CV. Output's going into Crucible again. And so now you can see when I turn up the mixer here, we're not hearing anything. And this is because those gate signals aren't high at the same time. We only have 1 gate signal. So now if I add 1 here, you'll hear that gate come through. So one of the cool things I like to do with this one is run triggers through. And then instead of using a gate output, I'm just going to run an LFO from my Modbox in here. And now when the LFO gets above that trigger threshold, we're going to hear the triggers come out. So this is a cool way to just kind of get a random pattern going. Whoops, wrong knob. So this LFO is not synced, and this is just giving us kind of a random pattern to play. All right, and so last is the OR function. And so OR is basically gate mixing. This is no matter what, if the gate's high, you get a gate output. This is really useful because some modules aren't protected on their gate inputs, and so if you mix 2 gates together and create a really high voltage signal, you can burn up that module. All WMD modules, of course, are protected against this, but it's just a good practice to use an OR function if you want to mix 2 gate signals together. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to run our gate signal out into channel A, and then we're going to take a stackable cable or this handy little Y cable, and we're going to go out a 10, and we're going to run that into B as well as the CV input. And so now You can hear I've just got 16th notes going, but let's just take this guy here and we'll make a sporadic guy. And then I'll put one there too, put one there on top of it. And you can hear that no matter what, as long as there's a gate or trigger present, we're getting those triggers. All right, so that's it. I hope this gives you some ideas for how to use the Select in your case. It is available at wmdevices.com as well as retailers worldwide. So thank you so much for watching. And yeah, like and subscribe, all those things, and we'll see you next time. Peace.